Hi, I'm back. Hopefully this not a new computer, but this other computer will get me through chapter 15 as well. I just spent a fair amount of time trying to reconstruct uh, the supplemental tabs that I used for the last lecture. So you'll get the experience I intended. And the first link is actually something I had prepped for the marijuana chapter, but did not show. In there was a discussion of commission created by President Richard Nixon to evaluate whether or what we should do about marijuana, and that was the Schaefer Commission. And be proud if you're a Pennsylvanian, because the chair of that commission was former uh, uh, former governor of Pennsylvania, there he is, Raymond P. Schaefer. I was looking further down the page. And, to their credit, they decided that marijuana should be legalized. And then Richard Nixon turned around and allegedly, because he wanted to oppress my people, which were hippies and anti-war activists, and cultural minorities, he did not do that. And we've suffered for that decision forever. A gift that keeps on giving. Okay, so that was from last lecture. This chapter, I'm not in love with the. There are much more friendly pictures of hallucinogenic experiences than this one. That's not very friendly. But I don't think it, as I recall, it doesn't turn into a horrible experience. Okay, so this opening vignette, you look at the title of the chapter, Hallucinogens, PCP, and Ketamine, and what's being used here is an hallucinogen, but it's not one you think of very often. When you think of hallucinogens, you probably think of something with 3 letters, for example. And so this is an odd one. It's odd, we'll see, in many ways. And I have tabs up top regarding it, and it's highlighted here. Salvia divinorum. It can grow as a weed. The first time I taught this course, oh boy, well, not this course, but the advanced course, I had a student from Jersey who said that this stuff, you would be kicking it as you walked along the sidewalks of Jersey. Marijuana also has some weed-like properties, and thus the term. Sorry, that was an intentional joke, but it grows wild, and it grows wild in this part of the world. But it's illegal in this part of the world, as we will see. Oh, please, no. Okay, so there's a list of hallucinogenic drugs, and these really are the classics: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, DMT, and then salvia, the one we just looked at. I skipped some, but I just wanted to do the big ones. Originally, your federal government, when it wasn't busy suppressing the use of these drugs, was investigating them for various purposes. Um, there was a theory that they mimicked psychosis. They don't seem to. And I think in another lecture I mentioned that the psych department at UCLA had some mystery added rooms to it that possibly were from the CIA dealing with this kind of stuff, and we'll see that later in this chapter. And there's mescaline, peyote buttons, not very common these days, but they've been used for a long time. A few thousand years before the Spanish invaded, 5,700 years old. And they're, the Native American Church of North America, founded in 1918. It's part of their religious ceremonies. Many of these drugs that derive from this part of the world are used for religious ceremonies. And if you're part of that religion, you get to. Psilocybin, shrooms. And there in red, psilocybin is enzymatically converted to psilocin. So it's a little bit like heroin and morphine. You may remember that heroin is converted into morphine before it hits the receptors. And these mushrooms are used for religious purposes too. And down below, a different species of mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, fly agaric, produces a state of delirium that includes hallucinations. But boy, its mode of action is way different. And muscimol should ring a bell, and very different, very different. But if hallucinations are your target, apparently it gets you there. Hallucinogenic mushrooms. Oh, this is such a cute story. 3,500 before Christian era, people holding mushrooms and dancing. Even in the modern era, a lot of these recreational drugs are mixed with dancing, and dancing is often part of religious experiences too. Um, and so there are people holding mushrooms and dancing, and a man, possibly a shaman, with mushrooms growing out of his body. Um, Interesting. When the Spanish came over and decimated the locals, largely through disease, but they really didn't care. Um, in the earlier chapter, we saw that they eventually came to like the locals using cocaine, chewing cocaine, because they could work harder for the man and longer, and that was great. But here, these things are used for religious purposes, altered states of consciousness. The Spaniards were very intolerant of other religions, and they suppressed the heck out of this usage. So suppressed that we didn't even know what was going on for a long time. And there's the Gordon Wasson visited in 53 and again in 55, and took the mushrooms with Maria Sabina. And since this is so modern, there she is. There she is. And there are the mushrooms. I had no idea they were that big. Those are big. Um, and when I was giving this lecture the first time, I was struck that the woman behind is carrying a child, and a young child. But unlike us and recreational drugs, these people did not expose their children to the recreational drugs, even if they were invited to the social event. And this quote here is, the mushrooms were not served to the children, and vivid colors and mythological beasts, and dude, that's quite. For the first time, the word ecstasy took on real meaning. For the first time, it did not mean someone else's state of mind. Watson, 1957. And pretty soon, I think we have to pick up on this issue. And there's Timothy Leary. Now, this I didn't do for the other class, but there's a classic Timothy Leary picture that is not based on him drawing something he experienced, but it's in many of my books. I don't know, not a good day. But it's sort of a psychedelic picture of Timothy Leary's head. Sorry, I thought this would come up. Let me try Timothy Leary. Nope. Maybe it was made for the textbook. This is an interesting picture with mushrooms, and that you'll recognize in the chapter how LSD is often consumed. Okay, let it go. It must have been made for a textbook, and therefore it's not generally available. It was a cute picture. So, and Leary he went to Mexico, and later he took LSD, and he formed this organization with other researchers, the Harvard Psilocybin Project, to teach individuals how to self-administer psychoactive drugs in order to free their psyches without reliance on doctors or institutions. This was a general theme back in those days, as I dimly recall them, and it's not dim because I took these drugs. I didn't, but I'm old, and it's a long time ago. But breaking free of the man, and finding your own way, and how these drugs can help you with that was notable. And there's a list of people who took these drugs, and it affected them, their writings and their thinking, and well, it reinforced their thinking. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. Here's my tab on salvia, and it's not attractive. It, as I said, it grows wild in the streets, apparently somewhere out there. And there was a famous female musician who was we'll see the structure again later in the chapter, who had a YouTube video using this, and that prompted some interest. I looked it up. It is definitely illegal in Pennsylvania. And where's the link? The state of Pennsylvania made salvia and bath salts illegal in the same bill. Now, if you remember your bath salt chapter, which was the cannabis chapter, that's not how the bath salts work. They mess with catecholamines, and they're very aggressive and potentially very dangerous. And it's odd that salvia was put in the same bill with the bath salts. And I still think it's odd that your textbook put bath salts in the cannabis chapter. Here's a movie from long ago. It was a very interesting theory, altered states. Not bad reviews. You can go to Penn Avenue in Scranton and other places and get into a flotation tank. Highly concentrated water, sensory isolation. It can have mind expanding properties. This person went to the little country of Mexico and tried to, as they did in the earlier part of or the 50s, 60s, 70s. They went there. They tried to find drugs, and he was looking for mind expansion. But the interesting theory he had was that your DNA is the DNA also of your ancestors, like going all the way back, and that hidden in our DNA is our evolutionary past. And he was trying to not only unlock his mind, but he was hoping to regress. And I'll have to watch the movie to see how that goes. Okay, as long as we're on this roll, I like cooking. And this author, Michael Pollan, he's brilliant. He dives deeply into topics, really understands them, and writes books about them. And if you prefer to watch things instead of read things, because there's a book on, that he's written on this topic. Netflix has a documentary explored through the lenses of four natural elements: fire, water, air, and earth. It's an enlightening and compelling look at the evolution of what food means. I do not view food the same way after having watched this, and the bread chapter in particular is very interesting to me. And what we call bread today is not. Big bread got the federal government to change the definition of bread so they could sell us what we eat today. It's not what it was. Um, I encourage you to watch that. But why am I talking about him in this chapter? Because he did a deep dive into recreational drugs or psychedelic, mind altering drugs. And here's a book that I think I usually pick one book a summer to do a deep dive into. This summer, I haven't been able to do a deep dive. I was taking a course on computer programming and artificial intelligence until I started teaching this course. And I haven't read anything this summer, but this is my last year's book. So, How to Change Your Mind: What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. And classic Pollan, brilliant. And he's like me. He went through, the 60s, 70s, and we didn't do drugs. And now he decided to try it. But boy, he does it religiously. He does not just, party on, dude. He goes to professionals and he has very strong opinions on this, very responsible opinions. If you also don't like to read but want to listen to things, one more. Sam Harris, unlike Pollan, he is a neuroscientist. And he's a philosopher and a neuroscientist. And he has done a lot of drugs earlier in life. He's not as old as Pollan and I, but he's got a podcast, Waking Up with Sam Harris. And he did an episode, and these things are long. It'll probably be over an hour. I don't know if it's marked there, but May 2018, and it coincided with the publication of the Pollan book, and it's very interesting to hear the two of them talk about meditation and mind expansion and the book and Pollan's experiences, Harris's much more random experiences. And okay, now I think, no, that's spoiler alert. Okay, so back to the chapter. So those are extra things you could look at if you feel like it. Desert toads. People will do a lot of pretty crazy things to have a mind expanding experience, and there's one of them. Secretions of a toad. The DMT. And by the way, when you read this, you'll see that some of these things can't easily be taken orally because of first pass enzymatic degradation by the liver, unless you're clever enough, and the natives are, as we'll see down below, to figure out a way to stop that from happening. But also, one thing that's important to me in this chapter is some of these things And Pollan, I mean, he's a well-regarded author. He probably had a book advance. He had time and money, and he could blow a couple days doing, you know, recreational drugs. But I mean, real life people, who's got the time? But this is, DMT lacks bioactivity orally because of metabolism, but you can smoke it or snort it, and it only lasts about 30 minutes. And there's synthetics, Foxy, that can be done orally. Ayahuasca, Vine of the Soul. These people are so clever. They know their ecosystems and they know their plants. And if you want to take this, of course, they don't know about first pass enzymatic degradation in the liver, but you have to mix things together and you have to get some MAO inhibition going because that's involved in the first pass metabolism. And MAO inhibitors were used to treat depression. And when you mix these things together correctly, you can take it orally and it works. Um, so there's the first pass metabolism. And but the onset can be delayed for hours, and then they can persist for hours. So who's got the time? Um, this is a religion, and yeah, there's an interesting melding of the religion that Spaniards were practicing, Catholicism. They melded that with shamanism and folk traditions, and you end up with an interesting amalgam religion. There's LSD, really neat stories here, very synthetic. I'll tell the story here because I may forget. But there's a persistent rumor on the Scranton campus that in the early days, probably somewhere between the time I was a student here and when I came back, students in the chemistry department became very good at producing LSD. And they were famous apparently for the quality of their LSD. And then that stopped. And I'm pretty sure one of the reasons, although safety is an issue now too, that students aren't allowed to work in labs unsupervised is some of these things are easy to make, and some students did it a while ago. So it's interesting about the research on LSD, and this is relevant to the Pollan book that I mentioned. Before 1951, there were only 6 papers on LSD, but between 51 and 62, there were 1,000. So there was an explosion of interest in this in the late 50s, early 60s, and one reason for the explosion was there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, that we didn't know how neurons talk to each other. I think I mentioned that there were squirts and sparks long ago. One group thought that electrical signals went between neurons, which is a very reasonable thing to believe. And then other people had this crazy idea that it was chemistry, that chemicals were being exchanged. And Lowy, you'll remember the dream and vagus stuff and the Nobel Prize. That shook people up. And now you have a drug, LSD, that at incredibly low doses has tremendous mind altering, long lasting mind altering effects. It really caught people's interest. And one way of using LSD was psycholytic therapy. In other words, in a controlled environment with a therapist, um, to expand your mind and try to work through things and come to understandings that would be very difficult to do in a non-drug drug state. That was popular, and then it was suppressed. And in the Pollen book, you'll see we're redoing a lot of the early stuff. And ergot poisoning was quite the deal. In the second paragraph, although no outbreak of ergotism has occurred in recent years, common in the Middle Ages, death of as many as 40,000 people in 944. So, it was really potent. And Hoffman was working with LSD or lysergic acid, and he went through a lot of permutations, which is what chemists do, and he came up with L-lysergic acid diethylamide, which he abbreviated LSD-25, and the rest is sort of history. Um, and he was not trying to alter consciousness; he was trying to help respiration. And he saw structural similarities and twisted them and turned them and hoped it would work, but it didn't work. Then he just put it away for 5 years, and then after 5 years he played with it. And I'll tell you, even in my lifetime, chemical safety has changed dramatically in labs. uh, I was working with radioactivity at UCLA, and no gloves, and I can't keep my fingers out of my mouth. And I'm sure I gave myself some doses of something back then. And he's working in the lab. Last Friday, April 16th, 1943, he had to stop because he got weird, and he went home and dreamlike state. Uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, intense kaleidoscopic play of colors, and 2 hours it went away. So what did he do? He went back to the lab, and he took 250 micro, not milli, 250 micrograms of this stuff, which is vanishingly small, and put it in water and didn't worry about first pass. He drank it, and goodbye. Managed to ride his bicycle home with the help of his assistant. That day became known as Bicycle Day. And he had a little bit of a bad trip, and then he had kind of a good trip and well-being. And he went back to the lab and told his friends, and his friends said, "Oh, no way, dude." Of course, they didn't say dude in 1947 or in the 40s. And they said, "Well, let me do it." And they did it, and the rest is history. Um, and he lived a long time. Continued to write and lecture about LSD and other hallucinogens, even after stopping working from Sandoz in 1971, the year I graduated from the university, and died in 2008 at the age of 102. So this is not like meth. Um, so then there's all these studies, and in this book says that they were not well done, and the inappropriate controls and blah blah blah. And it's quite possibly true, particularly to the extent that these were done by physicians who are remarkably typically not well trained in scientific methodology. Uh, so we're, as Pollen is saying, we are basically doing all over again things that we did in the 70s. And there's the army giving drugs to volunteers, and what they had hoped for was to like fog a battlefield with this stuff. And we were in Vietnam, and if you could just fog the battlefield and your enemy came laughing out of the trees, disoriented and unable to hurt you, that wouldn't have been a terrible thing, but it didn't work out very well. And there's the CIA, who Michael worked for, And they didn't do it to volunteers. And apparently they wanted to, well, not apparently, they wanted to, we know they wanted to take out Castro. I didn't know about Nasser, but apparently we didn't do that one. And, the hippies, Woodstock, that was big. I forget. There's an audio of Woodstock where they're announcing over the PA system, do not take the brown LSD. It's bad. I don't know what the bad LSD was. And then, we have organizations that are trying to do this right. And there's a discussion, and that relates to the picture with the psychedelic picture with the mushrooms and the little square on the tongue. To get 250, 250 micrograms is probably too much. To get that little lawfully into a dose, this is actually quite clever to dissolve it in water, spread the water across paper, let it dry out. The drug should, randomly distribute across the paper evenly, then cut the tabs up, and unless it turns brown, because the brown LSD is bad, it's potent. It's crazy potent. Crazy, crazy. Okay. Now, what I didn't want to spoil with, spoiler alert, is I've never really dealt with these. 2010, a new class of synthetic hallucinogens comes up. This is the new edition of the book for me, and I haven't really thought about these very much. And pronouncing it is an issue. And you can see in this section that the names, based on the chemistry, the names change, of course, because except for the product names, now often they are named based on the structure of the molecule. And okay, so this blue tab. So we go to this page, and we are trying to translate. I probably shouldn't scroll. This word, which is the one we just saw on the page, right here. And now we are going to go to the English pronunciation.
25 IN Bohm.
25 IN Bohm.
25 IN Bohm. 25 IN Bohm.
So 25I and Bohm. Sure, why not? 25I, 25 IN Bohm. That hyphen kills me. 25 IN Bohm. 25 IN Bohm. 25 IN Bohm. And there's a discussion of different bones, and there's 25 IN Bohm. You got to worry about anything that leads to overdoses. Oh boy. Does this book talk about the elephant? I don't think it does. Maybe it does in a different chapter. But they killed an elephant with LSD once. What was motivating them to put LSD into a giant animal, I can't tell you. But they just scaled up the dose from humans, and it died. And Bohms are very potent like LSD. Humans don't die from LSD overdoses with any regularity, but this apparently is maybe a bit more aggressive. And salvia. I've already shown you the picture, and the picture in Wiki is, this is a little more attractive, although I would not grow that for fun. What was the date? I think we made. I had that up here. I swear I had it. I think it's around 2010 when we made it. Let's just search for it. So salvia, illegal. Here we go. This is the article I had up. It's a very short one, but it tells the story and gives the date. We don't need the video. So Tom Corbett, another governor of Pennsylvania, and boy, I met Bill Scranton, whose family gave us the property that our campus is built around. He was a lovely, brilliant guy. So Tom Corbett signed a bill that bans the sale of synthetic drugs. Wait a minute. This may not be the article. Yes. So there's the title: Salvia and bath salts. Is salvia a synthetic drug? What station is this? Oh, geez, a CBS affiliate. Salvia is a weed. Bath salts. That's synthetic. And so in the state of Pennsylvania, where you sit, or I don't know where you are actually. So this was June 23rd, 2011, that salvia and, well, there's no doubt about bath salts being a bad idea. Salvia, and the feds still have not decided what to do with salvia. So natives, when they use this, they chew it, and it's a kinder, gentler, mind-expanding experience. At least it can be. When our modern people use it in the United States, they take the leaves and they set them on fire and smoke it. And onset is really fast, and it only lasts minutes. And look at the symptoms. You become an object. Yes, I'd like to become a yellow plaid French fry, please. I'd like to become fresh paint. Visions of various two-dimensional surfaces, films, membranes, revisiting the past, loss of body and or identity. Now try to get your head around that one. And by the way, this effect of psychedelics is one of the things that may have therapeutic use. Motion, being pulled or twisted, uncontrollable hysterical laughter, overlapping realities. In English, we don't have a word for the plural version of consciousness, which is, presumably what your reality is. We are completely intellectually committed to there only being one consciousness. And with brain surgery, you can stimulate parts of your temporal lobe and apparently, and sometimes get a dual consciousness. And with salvia, you can sometimes get it. Without the use of drugs or electrodes in your temporal lobe, very hard to understand this. What is the plural of consciousness? Now, the uncontrollable hysterical laughter, I don't know. I have a gentle theory that there may be a gender difference on this. There are gender differences in responses to various drugs. And the viral video of the female, who I should know the name of, but I don't follow pop music, of her smoking salvia and getting the giggles. I I have a feeling it's more common in females. I don't know why. Um, and there's a lot of effects. And now, again, if you chew this, as the, the the native people who use this for religious purposes would use it, you don't get this weirdness, but you do get mind expansion and possibly the perception of deeper understanding of things. How do they work? Uh, we know one place we're going to be going. Oh, there's doses, and salvia at the bottom. Those are micrograms, and of course, 200 micrograms is zero point 0.2 milligrams. 1,000 micrograms is a milligram, but still that's pretty low. I mean, look at psilocybin, 10 to 20 milligrams, and look at LSD. Remember that when he tried that out, Hoffman tried that out, uh, looking for a safe dose. He used 250 micrograms, which is way above what you need. They just couldn't believe how potent it was. And there's time course. LSD typically lasts for 6 to 12 hours. And BOEMs 3 to 10, but DMT and salvia zip really fast. Complex set of reactions. We've already been dealing with a lot of that. Synesthesia, one of your colleagues who won the award for best doctoral dissertation in her field when she graduated from UCLA, and it was a national award, not a UCLA award. She had synesthesia. Colors and numbers would mix. And I have a friend who can feel like I've told this story possibly in the lecture you can't hear, where you show him your credit card and he will have memorized your complete number in like 1 or 2 seconds. And the password on my phone, I unlocked my phone, and before I could send a message, he sent me a message saying, "Dr. Cannon, why did you change your password from," and gave me my old password, "to," and gave me the password I had just used. And he freaks me out. He's scary bright, but he also has synesthesia, and he also has numbers turning into colors. Um, but depersonalization, uh, yeah, like you're not yourself, you're expanding, you're above, which also should remind you a bit of a near death experience, at least mine. Um, and there's altered states of consciousness, and that's the name of that movie. And there's rating scales for this. Since a lot of this stuff started in 50s, 60s, 70s, Freudian thinking was very, very big in medicine, and there's lots of terms in here that relate to egos and ego boundaries. And Pollan, in his book, ego comes up all the time, and it's like, okay, it's common English, but it's Freud, man. Um, and there's these scales, and on the next page you have a diagram of how psilocybin is affecting things, and it says it really doesn't affect impaired control of cognition and anxiety very much. I would say the disembodiment is a little bit weak, but it pretty much nails the rest. There's structure down at the bottom of this page. No, so let's look at the structures here for a second. There's our old friend serotonin, and you look at that for a second, and then you look at DMT, and you say, "Ooh, ooh, that looks a lot like serotonin." And then you go down to psilocybin and 5-MeO-DMT and LSD. LSD is a little harder to see, but if you look down the bottom here, you can see the core of the beginning of the structure of serotonin. So, I'm not a biochemist. I don't even play one on TV. But I like pictures, and yeah, I see it. Now, there can be autonomic effects, and one of the autonomic effects that really freaks me out is nausea and vomiting. I will not go there. There's the indolamine, which, and that's, these are, serotonin is an indolamine. There's a discussion here of some antagonistic effects, but then at the top of the next column, we shall see in the next section that LSD can be understood much more as an agonist than an antagonist for serotonergic systems. And mescaline and the N-bomes have a catecholamine-like effect. And we'll see, so far we've dealt with LSD, and here it says only mescaline and N-bomes have catecholamines. And where's salvia? Where's salvia? And there's mescaline and more hallucinogens, and there's structures. So there's norepinephrine, and next to that is mescaline. And mescaline doesn't look like serotonin, I'll tell you. And there's amphetamine, and there's 25-ion bone. Yeah, I see it. And now we get back to my recurring Pennsylvania theme. The most unusual hallucinogen structurally as salvinorin A, which is down the bottom of the page. Oh my, look at that. That's like you're looking at chemical structure under the influence of an hallucinogenic drug. That looks like nothing we've seen up to now. Ketocyclazine, no, that's different. What's going on there? And it says it's similar. I'll have to take that on faith. I'm not a biochemist, but all I can say is salvia is weird. And then how are they working on serotonin? And geez, LSD binds with, look at all those receptors, millions of receptors. And then other hallucinogenic drugs, psilocybin and DMT, non-selective serotonergic receptor binding. But it simplifies to 5-HT2As, pretty much. Why does it last so long? This is a really neat story on this, in this section. So, way back when we talked about neurotransmitter receptor sites, which are really sites on complexes, which are often have multiple sites for different kinds of drugs. You have to wonder, like morphine and naloxone. So if morphine has bound to the receptor site, causing the morphine overdose, how the heck does naloxone save a life? Because naloxone has to bind to the receptor site, and if the receptor site is already occupied by morphine, naloxone can't bind. But normal receptor sites and normal interactions between drugs and receptor sites, the morphine binds, does its thing, and the receptor site spits it out. Just goodbye. And then, the morphine's floating around in space and random motion happens, and it's going to come back. And it'll affect it and spits it out, and it'll come back. So if you've got nothing but morphine in the system, morphine is going to keep hitting your receptors over and over and over again. Now we throw in naloxone, which has much, much greater affinity for that receptor site. And now there are two kinds of molecules flying around that receptor site, morphine and naloxone. And naloxone just goes straight in and does nothing and comes off. and comes back in and does nothing. And naloxone blocks morphine, even though there's a pound of morphine in there. That's because receptor sites are dynamic and things go on and off. What's with LSD? And it's like the centrifuge tubes in a lab. They have little pop tops, and you put your chemical in your tube, and you snap down the top, and click, and now you can turn that tube upside down. You can shake it, and that chemical is not coming out of there. It is trapped inside the closed tube, and for reasons I can't explain, that mechanism seems to be triggered by LSD and some other drugs, where they tuck themselves into the receptor complex and get stuck there. And I don't think I want that. Now, laboratory animals, it's interesting they use the head twitch, which came up in the catecholamine chapter. Now, drug discrimination tasks came up many times in the book, but it's interesting that they twitch. I don't think I completely understand or even partially understand why. Boy, it's a little slow today. There's salvinorum, and hello, it's kappa opioid. Opioid. We haven't even had a glimmer that opioids can produce hallucinations. Well, you didn't meet my mother. Some people, when they're given morphine, they get a little odd. And mom was on a trip, talking to dead people, and like, mom, come back. And possibly some of that was because morphine can affect kappa receptors, and kappa receptors, all people are not the same. Write that down. We are different. We love diversity. At least I do. And the same drug to two different people can have dramatically different effects. And then if you take a drug that specifically targets the kappa receptor, you get quite a trip. And where is it? At the bottom of the paper, the page, it's in the thalamus. Okay, temporal cortex. By the way, you want dual consciousness. That's one place to put an electrode. Parietal cortex, orientation in space, owning your own body. Oh yeah, this guy that was in my psychopharm class the first time I taught it, who's from Jersey and apparently used this. He said he took salvia and his arm fell off. I said, "What are you talking about?" I'm looking at it, and he said, "Oh no, my arm was not my arm." Whoa. And the claustrum. Now, I'll tell you, I teach, although this year I'm not, behavioral neuroscience lab, where I have a sheep brain dissection guide that's online. Feel free to use it. And there's this weird little triangle of tissue in the forebrain that is small, but boy, it shows up to my eye very, very clearly. And I'm always sticking pins in it for practicals, and it's the claustrum, 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 claustrum. And when I lecture about it, I say, claustrum, I don't really know what it does. Well, a Nobel Prize winner for DNA on his deathbed, no, I don't have the article, but he died in like 2008, and in 2009 there was an article published where he was an author. There we go. What is the function of the claustrum? I'm sorry, 2004, 2005, not 8 and 9. Francis Crick and, no, okay, maybe I take it back. I have the real article somewhere. All right, when did Crick die? But on his deathbed, he was proofreading an article about consciousness and the claustrum. And there he is. Boy, he looks like a Brit, doesn't he? And when did he die? 2004. Okay, so the article was 2005. And he was proofreading the article as he was dying in the hospital. And it was about the claustrum. And somewhere I have, I skipped almost. All right, well, let me just show you what the claustrum is. It's buried. This is it's a confusing section. But there's caudate putamen, there's caudate putamen globus pallidus, and between the putamen and the insular cortex, which we haven't spent much time talking about, it's buried. It's a buried lobe, and there's a lot of it. Look at all this. There's this little weird island of tissue, which is the claustrum. And I think all the cool vertebrates have it. Certainly sheep do. And this picture may be a little more clear. There it is. Now, because it's kind of sinewy and spread out, it's going to be difficult to lesion intentionally, because that would require a lot of hits. And unless we can figure out a cellular marker that can be used to attack it. But there it is, buried. That's your temporal lobe down here, some parietal lobe up there. There's corpus callosum. Oh, the mammillary bodies. Remember them in thiamine and Korsakoff syndrome. And there it is. And Crick and company decided it's listening to the whole cerebral cortex. And it may be focusing your consciousness. And the article I had also talked about another Nobel Prize winner. How many L's? This is a very readable book, by the way. Gerald Edelman. And I met him. We used to have a lot of money for speakers here, and we've had several come and talk through that financial resource. And he worried about consciousness toward the end too. And there's the book. If you want to read about consciousness, I recommend this. So this picture, and by the way, cognitive psychologists still use this analogy. The spotlight of consciousness. What are you focusing on? What are you conscious of? And Edelman had a theory, which was not the claustrum, but Crick and company were incorporating his thoughts in their theory of consciousness. Okay, so what is it? And very intriguing that you have a lot of kappa receptors in the claustrum, and it tremendously alters consciousness. Okay, a lot of results in this chapter, as this final sentence in the paragraph above hallucinogenic drug use. The results from brain imaging studies of hallucinogenic drugs must be interpreted cautiously, as these results are not always consistent across studies. These are new techniques, and we've been not encouraged to do research on this once they gave up on it in the military and the CIA. So we're paying a little bit of catch up here. Oh, by the way, over here, I see I did in red. So those are the mice I used to use, C57 black 6Js. And the J, by the way, means that they came from Jackson Laboratories in Bar Harbor, Maine, the #1 mammalian genetics research institution on the planet Earth. And one of my former students spent a summer or two there. It's a great place if you like genetics. And then there's a discussion DSM-5 and hallucinogenic use disorder. And here's mescaline in terms of upregulate or the down regulation. You can adapt to these drugs really quickly. It's really shocking. Or it's not salvium, salvinorin A, Venorin A, because that's working on a different receptor system. And mescaline may also be a difference in terms of receptors responding. If your receptor, swallows the drug and puts a cap on it and keeps it, you can imagine that you are probably going to have to do some receptor regulation after that. So there's mechanism of action of indolamine and phenethylamine hallucinogens, and there's our friend the NMDA receptor, and glutamate and AMPA and glutamate and 5-HT2A, which is metabotropic, and by the shape that looks like a pyramid, so that's layer 5, and that's prefrontal, which is important for lots of thought related and impulse related things. And then you have deep cortical layers. 5 is already pretty deep, but there's serotonin again, and there's brainstem spelled the way I don't really love it. Projections from the brainstem, dorsal and median raphe, are going to send a lot of projections to the forebrain. Boy, I hope there's audio for this. Flashbacks. Okay. Now there's another movie I'm going to give you a little review of, and here's the movie. It's a classic. What's the year on this? 1998. The Big Lebowski. And I've actually been in that bowling lane in Los Angeles back in the day, and I lust after that sweater, but it's very expensive. And you can see that bowling is important to the movie. But Lebowski is a stoner, doesn't do anything too productive. And I don't want to give away much of the storyline, but in college, I don't know if we would have, he was a protester. So it was during the Vietnam War period, and he was a protester. So, yeah. And this woman, Maud, she's here and here, takes a strange interest in him, and there's a dialogue. So here's a quote, and Maud, and she always called him Mr. Lebowski. He said, what do you do for recreation? And the dude says, oh, the usual. I bowl, drive around, the occasional acid flashback. So funny. Acid flashbacks really do happen. Sometimes people enjoy them. Some people don't. You don't need much LSD to make something happen. And if something has been in depot binding and kicks loose, stuff can go down. A former student and I were driving cross country. I picked him up in, I think, South Dakota. And we were driving, and I don't like to stop. And he started hallucinating cows. And he was a drug user back in the day. And I said, pull it over. I'm driving the rest of the way. There are no cows. So it's kind of funny, but as you can see by this picture, it's not always funny. This is serious stuff. I'm sorry. I just find The Big Lebowski very entertaining. Oh, I didn't finish with that. A group has formed a pseudo religion. I found these. My phone is trying to help me. So there's the dude. And notice what the button says. It doesn't say submit or enter. It says ordain me. And I am an ordained Dudist priest. There are 450,000 of us worldwide. Apparently, I can marry you. Okay. If you ever meet me live, I have my Dudist priest certificate in my wallet. Use therapeutically. Nice discussion there. This diagram, afterglow and residual effects. Yeah, when that works out, you can imagine that there are going to be there's going to be some potential for therapeutic use. And Pollan is pretty much death on doing this for fun and just messing with it. And this discussion of contemporary research investigating the therapeutic use of hallucinogenic drugs, careful attention to patient selection, a therapeutic session. They're usually conducted in a quiet treatment facilities, pleasant, relaxing ambiance. Yeah, not to be taken lightly. Not to be taken lightly. And see, well, what do we get down here? We got a sense of unity or oneness. I won't say what I think the drug was, but a student used to post on my discussion board, oh man, about 8 years ago, and they would have these amazing thoughts, and I just knew they were on a certain drug when they were posting. Sense of unity or openness, transcendence of time and space. But people meditate sometimes for decades to achieve these breakthrough mental states, and mescaline can mimic some of that. Deeply felt positive mood, joy, peace, love, sense of awesomeness, dude, reverence and wonder, a sense of awe. By the way, if you get a sense of awe in your regular life, that's a very good indicator for your mental health. Meaningfulness of psychological or philosophical insight, or both. Like you have a breakthrough. I really understand things. And now this next word you probably don't use in a sentence very often. Ineffability. And it's defined because the authors know you need to. Sense of difficulty in communicating the experience by verbal description. There's a former student who's must be using something. I forget what they said they were using, but they are convinced they can write books that will help people understand the universe and time and space and loving everyone. But they just have to, write it down while they're taking the drug, because when they're not taking the drug, they can't um, they can't communicate what happened during the drug. And one of my friends made the mistake of taking a comprehensive exam, a take-home part of it under the influence of a drug, and one of his answers was just gibberish. Um, but the term ineffable, let me recommend another movie, Good Omens. It's delightful. And it's just delightful. I think it's a 6 or 7 segment. This one, I like this one better. It's delightful. It's I I've already watched it twice, and I don't do that. But and it's not Netflix. It's on Amazon. And why I remember that is that a bunch of evangelicals wrote a hostile letter to Netflix to tell them to take it down, because, as you probably detected, one of these two people is a demon, and you can see the eyes. And he was portrayed too positively, and they didn't like that because demons are bad, clearly. But in here, ineffable came up over and over. And there's the definition: too great or extreme to be expressed or described in words. And I have a little video clip from the movie. No, I already watched the commercial.
Purpose of your visit to the United Kingdom?
I'm commanded by an ancient family prophecy. I'm going to
No,
use all the wisdom.
I'm sorry, I had this
my
paused.
To hunt down the heart of darkness and do all that I can to destroy it before it brings about the end of the world.
I'm sorry?
Vacation.
Don't you wonder what
Yeah.
God's really planning? God's plans. It's all part of the great plan. Are you going to say ineffable? It's ineffable. It's great. Hell has done its most.
God's plan is ineffable. When was the last time you saw that word? But it's part of this. You have these experiences, and you are left feeling that you really, really understood stuff, and but it's ineffable, and you can't really describe it. Boy, I hope this is recording, because I can't do this again. And so we're pretty okay. So we're done pretty much with. Okay, terminally ill cancer in Europe. Up until a few years ago, terminal cancer, people could go to Switzerland and take. I think it might have been LSD or possibly some other hallucinogenic drugs to help them deal with terminal cancer. Gee, what a horrible thing to do, to help people cope with the fact that they are dying. Nevertheless, as potential therapeutic applications of MDMA reviewed in Chapter 6, situation regarding classic hallucinogens bears close watching. Yes, it does. Okay, and now let's try to bring it home. So now we're doing ketamine. And ketamine and phencyclidine, they're simple, pretty straightforward. General anesthetics, PCP. People show no responsiveness to nociceptive painful stimulation, but they're weird. Trance-light or catatonic state characterized by vacant facial expression, fixed and staring eyes, maintenance of muscle tone, which is really not common. Waxy flexibility, which you can get with high doses of opiates, which I'm not encouraging you to think about as being relevant to the pharmacology here. PCP, they were pretty hopeful. Did not produce respiratory depression. And I used to do a lot of surgery on animals, and we used barbiturates, and respiratory depression and death was not all that uncommon. But there's something weird here, particularly with adults. They sometimes get agitated and very active. And then PCP became popular, angel dust. It's not very popular now. Ketamine, Special K, is much more popular. It is used as an anesthetic for certain medical problems, particularly in children. Used in veterinary work all the time. So basically, I was trained to use pentobarbital to anesthetize my rats, and I'm not sure. Now, by the time I got to mice, I was not using pentobarbital. But it you sometimes lost the animals because of respiratory issues. But now the common thing to do is a cocktail that involves ketamine, and much less likely to have problems. But what's weird is that you can do this to children and they don't freak out, but adults sometimes do. And I'm very intrigued by that. What changes in the brain what co-varies with the change in response to ketamine? Why do children take it and they don't have a bad trip, and adults can take it and they can have a bad trip? They don't have to, but they can. What changes? And then there's pharmacology, and there's crystals, and you can snort it, and an IV. You really have to want it for IV. Detachment from the body again, vertigo, floating, numbness, dreamlike, variety of affective reactions, drowsy, apathy, loneliness is a weird one. That is a weird one. What is the neuroanatomy and neuropharmacology of being lonely? Hostility towards the experimenters. That must be thrilling for them all. Cognitive disorganization, difficulty maintaining concentration, bad focusing. A lot of consciousness modifying there. What is it? Dissociative anesthetic or anesthesia. Ketamine and PCP. The thing about floating separate from your body, often looking down on your body. I think I've mentioned that I had a little near-death experience, and I went on Call the Doctor locally to discuss near-death experiences from a scientific perspective, because all I had on there were mystics. Near-death experiences are really, really real, and they can be life-changing. And by the way, that probably is related to why some of these drugs may be useful for treating conditions. But this out-of-body thing, floating above your body and looking down, I didn't quite get there, but boy, dissociated. Like something bad is happening to my body, but not me. I'm still here, kind of floating up out of my body. And the final part of that paragraph, spiritually uplifting or terrifying, heaven or hell. Very interesting. What is consciousness? and there's experiences which we've already, visions of supernatural, spiritual or supernatural beings, which of course are colored by the culture you come from, because they often teach you what kind of supernatural beings to expect. PCP and ketamine are non-competitive antagonists for NMDA, so non-competitive, that should make sense. And NMDA should make sense. And we saw this long ago. PCP ketamine binding is in the channel. So this is going to really affect things. Ketamine increases presynaptic glutamate release, therefore overactive glutamate transmission via non-NMDA receptors and within the cortex, which is a secondary consequence of NMDA. And now we're getting into the schizophrenic, the idea that glutamate is involved in schizophrenia. Proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which we haven't talked about very much, but the bottom line is increase in glutamate levels in the anterior cingulate, and cingulate has come up a lot. It's involved in pain. It's involved in initiating behaviors, moral dilemmas, even we're getting there. And here's the schizophrenia. We were hoping that LSD and stuff would be relevant to schizophrenia. No, it's not. And then we have the dopamine hypothesis. But now we're beginning to see the importance of glutamate and possibly specifically NMDA receptors in the prefrontal cortex, which is good. And hopefully that will help us, because I don't know if you've known a schizophrenic. I had a roommate who was one. Boy, you don't want schizophrenia. PCP and ketamine have significant abuse potential. Danger. There's no doubt about it. Any of these drugs, and reinforcing effects. And of course, we're going to find what we expect. Ketamine is rewarding in laboratory animals and people. There's in the middle of this, it says, on the other hand, rats will self-administer PCP directly into the nucleus accumbens. Thus, reinforcing effects appears to be dopamine independent. And both dopamine and non-dopaminergic mechanisms contribute to PCP and ketamine. So it's complex. Use and abuse, DSM-5. Oh man. Putting things in your vein is bad, and you always have to take into account what kind of people do this stuff. And I must have read this 5 times, and I'm still blown away that you take tobacco or marijuana cigarettes and dip them into a liquid containing PCP. Oh, good, that's what I want. And embalming fluid. You got to be kidding me. I've worked with embalming fluid quite a bit, thank you. So I assume it's formaldehyde related. I can't imagine anyone doing that deliberately. My fingertips will never be normal because of overexposure to formaldehyde. Wow. There's a discussion again about PCP is not very popular, but ketamine is. And some abusers were and are medical or veterinary practitioners, because it's just right there. They've got perfect solutions of it. And there's a mention of 2 people actually I don't know, famous ketamine users. I guess I'm old when I don't know these people. And a discussion of, interestingly, many of the ketamine-dependent individuals studied by Janssen, highly intelligent PhD students, straight A PhD candidate. Ketamine problem was harder than heroin. Okay. There's a discussion of dextromethorphan, and this amazes me pretty much because it's over the counter and or it's on the shelf, which is over the counter. You can get dissociative reactions, but boy, you have to really whack back a bunch of this stuff. I can't imagine doing that for fun, but people do things. They report a variety of experiences, euphoric, spiritual, or terrifying, heaven or hell. Chronic use, oh man, kidneys, GI, bad. Delusional thinking, that's good. D1 dopamine receptors, or increased D1 dopamine receptors, prefrontal cortex. And you'd like your prefrontal cortex to be working normally. I don't want my receptors up or down regulated, please. And researchers have found altered NMDA receptor levels, repeated treatment with high doses of ketamine, apoptotic cell death in the developing brain of both rats and monkeys. And we have EM pictures on the next page. So these are, no, not the next page. Here's the cough syrup. 8 to 50 times higher, but yeah, maybe you either take a quarter of an 8-ounce bottle or whack back 2. Nothing bad can happen there. And more talking. I know this is running long. Dextromethorphan is a powerful substance. High doses exhibit psychoactive properties. Other drugs discussed in this chapter. Severe reactions, particularly all people are not the same. If you're a poor metabolizer, or you're crazy enough to whack back 2 bottles of the cough syrup, it's still not regulated. But they're thinking about it. And now the scanning, the electron micrographs. You may remember from earlier on, I mentioned that there are 2 kinds of electron micrographs scanning, where you scan a beam across the tissue and it looks 3-dimensional, like those rat pups in the picture of fetal alcohol syndrome, and transmission, where we do most of our science. So here the tissue is sliced very, very thinly. It's sliced plastic. The tissue is embedded in plastic and sliced with glass knives. And here's the normal. This is a nucleus inside the cell. Looks very happy. Here's the nucleus inside the cell, and that's going away. Things are dying. Disruption of neurogenesis. Yeah, the cell's dying would do that. And there's a lot of compounding. It's complex. The book does a very good job of expressing when we don't know. And by the way, don't hold that against the science. When people just want the bottom line, the answers, that's black-white thinking, and that's not the way virtually anything works. So I really respect the textbook for doing that. Health authorities are concerned about increased availability and use of this dangerous compound. Yeah, sure, no doubt about it. Okay, ketamine is being tested for use as a non-opioid analgesic agent. I would say non-opiate for a variety of chronic, and boy, for chronic pain, you really do not want to go with opiates typically. By the way, it may have something to do with tolerance to opiates and the NMDA receptor, and ketamine may actually reduce the tolerance effects of opiates. Okay, where to go? So somewhere I skipped over it. I was going a little too fast. There was a mention that we are exploring the therapeutic effects of ketamine, and I'm sorry I skipped over it, but it's in there somewhere. And when the book was published, we were still looking and hoping that we would come up with something. Physicians, even when this book were written, were exploring off-label uses of ketamine for clinical depression. You know, the classic antidepressant drugs, they usually take weeks to work. And, you know, for the umpteenth time, all people are not the same, and all people do not respond well to those drugs. And we do have electroconvulsive shock therapy, which can work considerably faster than the classic drugs. And if you're suicidal, self-harm, this may really be the way to go, or at least historically. It can work in days. But ketamine may be something new and very exciting. And I didn't find the trigger in the text that was supposed to cause me to go to this page, but there it is. So Yale psychiatrists, pioneers of ketamine research, shed light on new FDA approval. FDA approval of esketamine gives doctors another valuable tool in their arsenal against depression and offers new hope for patients no one had been able to help before. This is a game changer, says somebody. I hope it's as magical as they suggest it is. It probably will not be, or will not be for everyone. But March 5th, we have a new drug in town, and I have a page called up for that drug. And there we go. I thought I had a specific image. Well, there we go. So there's FDA approves nasal spray for depression. So you know you can deliver drugs nasally, and we do this with naloxone. And one beauty of that is the dose will be quite low. There's only 28 milligrams per dose. It's presumably pretty protected from external interventions, although, you know, creative people can do creative things. And you just pop it up your nose and boom, boom. And this can help some people, and some people are helped very quickly. And I believe it's pretty darn safe this way. Now, the off-label use involves what I used to get for my mice. So this is what veterinarians would have, and some physicians. So you order it from the pharmaceutical warehouse, and you get these little vials with ketamine. And I believe they typically do IV administration of this. It says intramuscular. Okay, then I would do that. But I'd have to look up exactly how it's used off label. But people have been doing this off label for a while. Physicians have been taking a bit of a chance doing this by using it off label. It's legal, but it's not labeled for that use. And now finally we have this, and it is labeled for that use. And it's pretty big news. And I'm looking forward in the next few years to people discovering whether this thing works. Okay. I hope you enjoyed the class. I did, although giving lectures 5 times to get one recording was a little frustrating. Hopefully this works. So goodbye. Good luck on the final.